Well, Robert's tour of the horizon was so complete that I'm not sure which bit of it I'm going to pick up. But one thing I will say to try and contribute a different perspective on this, and I agree with a great deal of what Robert was saying, was that I think the police see too many movies. And indeed, politicians see too many movies. And I was giving a talk at Cambridge Institute of Criminology a couple of years ago, and just on the train randomly looked at how many films were on that night. It was a Thursday night. I just borrowed someone's newspaper and looked at how many police films were on television that night, counting the satellite channels. Would anybody care to guess how many there were? Alex, how many would you think? 12. Anybody else? Do I hear a higher?
I'll go for 50.
There were 57. And that was a random night. I mean, absolutely random. And there was only one even faintly like a documentary, and that was cops and cameras or something, or traffic cops. With very, very fast cut, as though they always caught somebody every 30 seconds in the way that these things are edited. And the problem with people, including police and politicians, seeing too much of this stuff is that especially for politicians, but would-be coppers, is they think that's what their job is. And when Michael Howard was Home Secretary in 1995, he said, I want the police to concentrate on their core job, which is crime. And that's total rubbish, because actually, as Robert was saying, that a lot of what police work is about isn't to do with crime. And indeed, there was a survey, I think, 1980, early 80s, of the 999 calls to Scotland Yard, of which 90%, something like that, had nothing to do with crime. But they did have to do with antisocial behavior, some of them, quite a lot of it, kids playing noisy games outside people's windows, things like that, which present social problems about discipline, family engagement, knowing your neighbor's kids, not being too frightened to intervene, all of that stuff, which was what you were talking about. And what I find both difficult and interesting at the same time about this false image, almost a kind of parallel version of policing that goes on in the media and in people's minds, is that when it isn't like that, which it isn't most of the time, people are rather disappointed, and particularly police officers are. And then politicians will say, well, if only you got tougher, or only we gave you more coppers, then it'd be more like the movies, right? Which actually is exactly the opposite, because when you get more officers on the street, then people kind of stop or go somewhere else. It's one of the sort of famous mantras that burglars wait until they see a bobby on the street, he turns the corner, and then they say, okay, I know where it is. I mean, it's just real life about harm, which is what interests me more than crime. Is a much more complicated and elusive concept. And the problem with this false model of policing as a kind of crime-busting outfit is that it does create false expectations about what the police can actually do, and a completely misleading notion of what they should be asked to do and with what. So that, for example, in the years that Ian was kind of working his way up through the ranks, Surrey, I think we were in Thames Valley before that and so on, you know, the notion of multi-agency work together was something that came up in the late 80s, early 90s. And I went to more of those meetings than I care to think, at which almost the only person who cared were the police. That you never see health people there, sometimes education, not very often. I mean, it was pathetic. And yet, a lot of the work that they were dealing with, the police were dealing with, wasn't to do with them. If you had a lot of drugs, for example, that's an alcohol problem. If you had a lot of truants who were burgling or shoplifting, that's a school problem as well. If you had a lot of illiterates who said, there's no hope of my ever getting a proper job, but crime will pay, and so especially in drugs. Again, that's a school problem. I will give you just a few little facts about this, which I think are quite interesting. One is that the studies of offenders over what they call cohort studies, of groups of people who they followed for 30, 40 years in their life, they found that the predictors of that small percentage who become persistent offenders, predictors of future offending are poor housing and frequent moves, poor education or dyslexia or other kinds of learning problems and lots of truancy, domestic violence and sexual abuse in the family, alcohol and drug abuse in the family, one or both parents unemployed, harsh and erratic parenting, and then you get to the one bit that has to do with the justice system, which is having an older brother or sister or a parent convicted of a crime before the child is 10. So therefore, every time you have what's called a success by locking somebody up or at least convicting them, you are increasing the likelihood of their child or younger sibling following the path. I think that's a perverse outcome, but nevertheless it keeps people busy. Now the point is, what we've got is the problem of predicting the past, right? Which is that in understanding the future, you really have to have understood that the past was not full of life on Mars, and there was plenty of stuff that was going on there. But in terms of the social relationships that Robert was so eloquently describing, right up to the 1970s, people did look after each other's kids, for a start, given that children are causing a lot of the distress as antisocial behavior. And the notion that you weren't frightened of teenagers, you weren't frightened to intervene, you weren't frightened of your neighbors, was absolutely core to the notion of policing by consent. And the problem, and as much as I've supported community policing since then, is that the building of relationships, even between the officers and the people that they are, whose community they work in, still doesn't mean that the community itself will cohere. And one of the interesting quotes that I can give you, Robert, after those wonderful series of quotes, is from John Stuart Mill, who says that you wouldn't expect to ride a horse or swim without practice. And citizenship, which is thinking of concerns beyond your own, takes practice. And the question, the degree to which we practice concern for each other's and wider welfare, I think, is a measure of the degree to which community policing could work. And I don't know how many of you saw the series we did last summer in Oxford called The Truth About Crime, but it was very interesting for us because time and time again we were looking at situations in which the antisocial behavior was being, was going on more or less unchecked, even though the community police officers certainly knew about it and wanted to do something about it. And the problem of harm, as distinct from crime, was something that was very hard and indeed left out of the crime figures, because unless they were reported to the police and unless action was taken, then it just didn't appear, except in the British Crime Survey, which doesn't include under 16s, doesn't include people in hospitals, mental hospitals, prisons, where a lot of harm also takes place. So what I'm getting at is that I see the future of policing as a more sophisticated attempt to orient our problems in a way in which police are not measured by the false expectation that they are somehow going to catch the bad guy by the commercial break, and that actually he will then be put away, or she will be put away because we'll have built enough prisons to keep going with that, rather than recognizing that every time we do that, we are increasing the likelihood of the very thing we want to stop.